Welcome everybody to our guest lecture series. My name's Dr. Katrina Farrugia Creel and I'm Head of Research in the Faculty of Education at the Royal Academy of Dance. Um, this season, which is the third digital season, but indeed the guest lecture series has been around since 2012. We've celebrated over the last year the coming together of so many different speakers. Um, we're still on working digitally in the fact that we're bringing so many different colleagues from around the world together. Indeed, both our faculty, students and alumni are spread very much around the world. This is a reminder also just to say that if you did have any questions for our speakers, please do pop them in the chat. I will speak with the invited guests for around 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. So welcome to this second event in the 2022-23 series, a conversation titled On Dance Studies in Contemporary Times. And I'm honored to be joined by two stellar voices in the field of dance studies, Melissa Blanco Borelli and Rebecca Rossen. Welcome to you both and welcome to our attendees. Ahead of our conversation this evening, I posed a couple of questions to drive this first part of the conversation. I'm first going to introduce each speaker and then invite each speaker to respond to my very first question. So our first speaker tonight is Melissa Blanco Borelli, who is a writer, dancer, cultural critic, associate professor of theatre, and the new director of the dance program at Northwestern University. Her research includes Blackness in Latin America, critical dance studies, performance studies, performative writing, popular dance on screen, feminist autoethnography, historiography, and the digital humanities. She's author of She is Cuba, a genealogy of the Mulata body, which won the De La Torre Bueno Prize for the best book in dance studies in 2016, and editor of the Oxford Handbook of Dance and Popular Screen published in 2014. And she's also the past president of the Dance Studies Association. Melissa, welcome. How did you get into the field of dance studies as a personal academic trajectory?
Well, first, thank you. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for inviting me and allowing me to share this space with you and Rebecca and the people here. Okay, how did I go? I kind of have a circuitous path. It wasn't necessarily straightforward, but I had been on this as for fun. I had been doing a lot of Afro-Cuban dance for I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. I don't know. And then I think Jacqueline Shea Murphy was or is still best friends with my then roommate, Ed Vandenberg. And through Ed, I met Jacqueline Shea Murphy and Jens Kiersdorf because they were all friends. And then I think Jacqueline came to see me perform. And then she asked me to come to Riverside and give a performance lecture about Afro-Cuban dance. And then she's like, oh, and she's, when she found out that I was halfway smart, I had gone to Brown University, blah, 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 and I was teaching. She suggested, oh, maybe you might want to consider thinking about the program because, so both her and Jens talked to me a little bit about the program. So I said, sure. And then she's like, oh, and then you can meet Susan Foster. I had no idea who Susan Foster was. It was only later that I realized she was started critical dance studies. It was only later that I realized who she was. So yeah, I went, I learned about the program and I applied and I thought, well, because I had done a lot of semiotics and film analysis in my BA and MA. So I really enjoyed that kind of framing or that kind of, that kind of analytical eye to watch film, to read literature, to watch performance. And I was seeing a lot of dance performances as well because I was living in LA and I used to go a lot to Royce Hall at UCLA. So I thought, well, hey, if I can do this kind of semiotic analysis to dance and performance, how great would that be? And then just pause, footnote, when I was an undergrad at Brown, at one point I was unsure about my major. And I remember I spoke with a professor whose name I can't remember right this moment, but she turned me on to this discipline of performance studies that Brown at that point in the 90s, early 90s didn't have, but Brown University being what it was like you can construct your own major. So I remember I spent like a month creating this whole thing about maybe switching majors. I never did it, but I just feel like that was something that led me to it later. So long story short, I got admitted into the Riverside program, and I was still a little bit tentative because I thought, oh, I don't know if I want to spend 4 or 5 years studying, but I loved it. I thought I was in my space of analysis and thinking about dance, performance, bodies, and then having the time to think, I really enjoyed reading theory and then applying it to dance. So that's how I got in, and that's the story. It's not like a big light bulb moment. Yeah, it happened to me. I don't feel like I chose it specifically. It kind of, the steps were there and I followed them, and here I am.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that. Our second speaker, Rebecca Rossen, is a dance historian, performance scholar, and choreographer. She teaches dance history and a variety of courses focused on gender, race, ethnicity, and nationality in physical performance, and graduate seminars in dance studies, performance theory, performance as research, and teaching methods. She's head of performance as public practice graduate program at the University of Texas in Austin. Rebecca is author of Dancing Jewish, Jewish Identity in American Postmodern and Postmodern Dance, published by Oxford University Press in 2014. And this book was the winner of the Oscar Brockett Book Prize for Excellence in Dance Research. Her current research focuses on representations of the Holocaust, memory, and trauma in contemporary dance. And from 2015 to 18, she led the Society of Dance History Scholars editorial board and served as editor of the Studies in Dance History book series. Again, another esteemed colleague and huge fan also of Rebecca's book as well as Melissa's book. Rebecca, welcome. How did you get into the field of dance studies?
Thank you. So first of all, again, thank you to echo Melissa's sentiments. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation and to be talking to you all from across time and space here in this Zoom world. So my trajectory is a little different than Melissa's. Well, first of all, Susan Foster also entered my life early. I didn't understand the significance of that because I was a college student, but she was my technique and dance composition teacher at Wesleyan University, which is where I first experienced performance as research in her technique classroom. I just wasn't aware that she was actually teaching her first book, which looked at the semiotics of dance, because I was not aware that professors wrote books when I was in college. But my trajectory was really through being a professional dancer and artist. So throughout my 20s, I danced in dance companies. I worked as an independent choreographer in Chicago, which is where I'm from, and was doing steady work throughout my 20s in a lot of different ways, making dance, choreographing dance, curating dance festivals, and doing a lot of teaching, adjunct, with very low amount of pay to sort of sculpt together a living wage. And I loved teaching and I was getting really good at it. And I was frustrated with the low pay. So I thought, I need to get a graduate degree so that I can have a more permanent job. And so I was really unsure about what path to take because I applied both to a bunch of MFA programs and also to PhD programs. So I was like, do I want to continue to be a maker dancer, or what's this thing called dance studies? And I have a mom who buys me dance books. And one of the books that she gave me at this time was Jane Desmond's Meaning in Motion. And it was an intersection between dance studies, which was a field I was unaware of, and cultural studies. And it was my first exposure to dance scholarship, and I had trouble reading it. I have to admit, it was hard for me to read dance scholarship at first. So I would take it with me to the gym and would read it on the treadmill. And as I kind of increased the amount of time I could stand to be on the treadmill, I would gradually increase the amount of dance scholarship that I could read. And I started getting really, I didn't love the treadmill. Like I didn't like, didn't become a love for me, but dance studies really piqued my interest. And one of the authors in that book was Susan Manning, who is still at Northwestern, where Melissa is and where I got my graduate degree. And since she was local, I called her up and asked if I could meet with her. And talking to her was really just a fundamental shift for me. And so ultimately, I decided I didn't want to go to graduate school to reinforce what I was already doing in the professional realm, but I wanted to go to graduate school to learn something completely new. So for me, that was a PhD program. And over the course of the 7 years I was in graduate school, my identity really shifted. So I began very adamantly, like, I am an artist who is getting a doctorate. And then I was like, I'm an artist scholar. And then I was like, I'm an artist scholar. And then by the end, I was a scholar / artist. And so I really did not expect to become a scholar. I really thought I would take this PhD and continue to be an artist. But I just loved dance scholarship and dance history and writing so much that it opened a completely new career path for me. And I will just say one more thing, and that is where I was in grad school, which is where Melissa is. I was actively encouraged to combine my dance work and my dance making with my research, both by Susan Manning and also by Dwight Conquergood, who's was one of my mentors. And so I did a lot of dance experiments that we would now consider performance as research. I did not know that term, performance as research. I conceived of it as a dance ethnography because I was learning ethnography. And those experiments, which I'm happy to talk about later if you want to know more about them, led me to my first book project.
And that really is a great segue into the next part of our conversation, where I'm inviting both Rebecca and Melissa to talk about interdisciplinarity and how that informs their scholarship. And I've certainly asked both Melissa and Rebecca to talk primarily at the moment about their current books, She is Cuba and Dancing Jewish. And later on, we'll talk a little bit more about what sort of new material that they're kind of working on. But let's start with interdisciplinarity, because that's kind of a sort of a little path into both your worlds as writers, as people interested in dance studies. Melissa, would you like to go first?
Sure. So She is Cuba is is a theoretical inquiry into the hips of the mixed race woman in Cuba. And it traces I like to say it's an alternative popular dance history through the body of this mixed race woman and her relationship to cultural history, religious history, and political history in Cuba. So already there, political, cultural, historical, right? So yes, as someone who was practicing the social dances and the sacred dances of Cuban popular culture, I had the embodied experience and the embodied knowledge, but interdisciplinarity plays in that, okay, you have to put it within a particular historical context. You have to put it within a particular historical scope. What was going on in the 19th century in Cuba that allowed for these spaces of social dance to emerge? And then that brings in critical race theory. It brings in histories of colonialism and imperialism. It brings in gender politics. I'm looking at cigarette, tobacco, marquillas de tabaco. I can't say it in English. The tobacco, right? So then visual history, visual culture. How do you read that? And then this, where our training comes in as critical dance studies scholars, we're trained to start from the body and move outward. So I think interdisciplinarity is critical dance studies. It can't be without interdisciplinarity. And I actually sometimes I worry, because I think about, right, this sort of hegemonic theory of knowledge production, and like, well, if you're supposed to be an expert in one thing, what is that one thing? But I think that that's, as we all know, that's kind of a fiction of sort of white supremacist culture that creates this genius model and this unified subject that only knows, that is an expert in one thing. Because to know dance is to know history, is to know culture, is to know politics, is to know et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that you can do critical dance studies without being interdisciplinary. Yeah, that would be my response, to keep it short and sweet.
You're muted.
Thank you, Melissa. Rebecca.
That was a great explanation. I began, I think both Melissa and I went to graduate school around the same time, which was at this beginning of defining something called dance studies. And what I noticed in the early days in the 1990s about dance studies was how dance scholars were really interested in how dance made meaning in the world, how dance embodies, performs, reflects, produces social, historical, political meanings, how it can reinforce the status quo or advance social justice, rebellion, resistance. And in order to do that, dance scholars were looking for theories and tools from other disciplines, while also trying to justify dance studies as a legitimate field. And in sort of taking those theories from other disciplines, dance scholars were also arguing for dance as a legitimate form of academic inquiry, and often unconsidered in a lot of writing about cultural representation or arts. Dance was generally left out. And so my book was seeking to make one of those first interventions in a field that was primarily really text focused, very logocentric, which is Jewish studies. And I think this has to do somewhat with the sort of idea of Jewish people as the people of the book, and as opposed to people of the body. As an artist, I never thought about my Jewishness in relation to my work until I saw an exhibit. So here's where another discipline here, art. I went to this exhibit at the New York Jewish Museum, which was called "Too Jewish" with a question mark. And it looked at postmodern, avant-garde, contemporary artists representing Jewishness. Jewishness was not something I even understood as a concept. And I started to see reflected there themes and images that were actually in my own work. There was also a videotape of David Dorfman, who's a choreographer I write about in my book. And it was the first sort of seed for me of trying to think how Jewishness and dance might come together. So my first book, Dancing Jewish, looks at how Jewish choreographers from the 1920s to the early 2000s represented themselves as Jewish people through dance performance. And I track a number of themes and tropes that I felt were very frequently repeated in terms of imagining what Jewishness might be, like biblical heroines and narratives, nostalgic imaginings of Eastern Europe, relations between the US and Israel. And I started to track how these themes repeated in dances by Jewish people across the 20th century, and how those representations were similar, but also how they shifted in relation to changing social, historical, political context. And my goal was to try and write Jewish dancers and choreographers into American Jewish history, because they've been almost completely excluded, but also to make an intervention in the field of Jewish studies, where there was a lot of writing about Jewish bodies, but absolutely no discussion about how bodies move in space and time. It was there was no knowledge or sort of ability to really analyze bodies as they move in space and time. So from Jewish studies, I took history, and I took ideas about what Jewishness might mean and all of its complexity, And then I applied it to dance studies and utilized methods, specific methods from dance studies to analyze the dances that I wrote about.
I mean, you were both really quite trailblazing across your both your cultures, really, because had anybody sort of began to sort of articulate the mulata, or I mean, Rebecca, you just sort of ended up by saying, this idea that very few people were looking at the identity of movement, and I really sort of both books I think really stand out as being those uh, trajectories through which we learn so much more about a culture by looking at the dance form. So that really kind of resonates, certainly with me. But if we think about, your own methods for creating new scholarship, and we can talk a little bit about some of the topics that are sort of tickling you at the moment, really sort of getting your brain sparking. Um, Melissa and Rebecca, would you maybe sort of talk us through some of your forthcoming ideas in your new scholarship and what kind of methods you are utilizing as part of generating this new material?
These are really great questions. All right, let me see. Here I have like the umpteenth draft of like the book proposal. Or the oh, I'm assuming I'm going first, yes? Or I jumped in. So she's Cuba, I do use the autoethnographic, or what there's a new term now called auto theory, like speaking, or I don't even know what that, right? But part of the intervention I think my book makes is I think it also sits within sort of Black feminist studies without necessarily saying it's Black feminism or it's informed by it. So because of my interest in Blackness in Latin America, and then also thinking through heritage, my own heritage, the next book is actually on Colombia, because Cuba is my paternal inheritance and Colombia is my maternal inheritance. And this current book project, I'm looking at this idea of displacement. So displacement as part of the aftermath of civil war, the armed conflict in Colombia, and what it does to rural peasant farmers, majority Black and indigenous citizens of Colombia. So I'm looking at it again. We have to look at the political historical context and this idea of displacement, but then I'm thinking about it also as a type of aesthetic strategy, and how perhaps it could be a productive way to think about how Colombian cultural producers are making work that's informed by their particular colonialist histories, to try to change or try to gain visibility in a country that tends to invisibilize, given its predominant look towards Euro-American aesthetic practices. So in this new project, I look at dance, I look at theater. I can share screen and show you. How do I share screen? One second. Can show you the choreographer that I write about. I don't know. I can't. Where do I share screen? There it is. Sorry. So let me click here. Screen. And then you should see that, but I actually want you to see, one second. And it is here. This is one. So it's a company named Sankofa Danza Afro, and these are the various works. So I write about, so far I've written about this piece, La Ciudad, the City of Others, and I write about the La Mentira Complaciente, the Accommodating Lie, which I've seen both at the Joyce Theater. So I'm looking at the ways this particular choreographer thinks about anti-racist and feminist practices through his choreographic strategies. And he's actually a student of Germaine Cogny. So part of the intervention is also to create this diasporic analysis beyond sort of, when we think of diaspora, sometimes the Black diaspora is very US based, and its relationship to the rest of the world and the theorizations that come out of the US. So this project is making me delve into Latin American, Black, Latino philosophers, decolonial philosophers, to think about what it is they're theorizing about Black identity in Latin America that has similarities and resonances with greater diasporic thinking, but also very, very specific to the colonial histories of Colombia in this instance. So for this piece, I use Robin Bernstein's idea of scriptive things to think about the raffia. That's basically the only object other than the dancers on the stage. I mean, the only sort of the stage design and the costumes are based around raffia and the relationship of raffia to greater Afro diasporic practices. But I also look at film, because film, photographic archives, digital archives as that was part of the grant project I just finished. And what else? Sound. So that's a new realm for me, sound studies, and applying sound studies again to corporal reality, right? The relationship between sound and body. And I know that J. Power Sotomayor does a lot of great work on that in terms of dance studies. So I'm delving into new spaces, but I'm not scared. I'm just excited to actually find the time to sit and actually read so I can write. Because I actually enjoy writing. My challenge is finding the time to write. But once I sit down to write, it's great. Like, because I know a lot of people struggle with writing, and I'm not saying that writing is not easy. But I can get a real rough draft down quickly as long as I have time. And then I don't mind the rewrite and the rewrite and the rewrite. So the book project's on Colombia, and then I have several and I tend to do, because I like popular culture, I always try to do like one-off essays. I have one that I'm trying to finish up for Theater Journal on Eurovision, and particularly 2021. Here, I'll stop sharing screen. Particularly 2021 Eurovision, where I thought there was a lot of Black representation from European nations. Like Israel even though Israel's not Europe, but Israel competes in Eurovision. So Israel, Sweden, San Marino, and Netherlands specifically had singer performers that were Black. So I thought, that's interesting. And, given what was going on in the world in 2020 and 2021, so I'm looking at televisuality, spectacle, Black embodiment on Eurovision to think about Europeanness post-Brexit and current migratory histories of Blackness in Europe. It's a fun project, but I'm so sick of watching those videos, can I just say? Because you have to watch these things over and over so you can write about what the bodies are doing, right?
I mean, that merits an entire conversation in its own right. But I think for me, Melissa, your journey through, in reading, and I just found my copy because I think just the images of
my aunt's pictures, except for one. Those are family pictures from my aunt's photo album. Yeah.
They're just so
except
beautiful
for one of them. Yeah.
to see. But also your own, as a scholar, your progression as well, going through so many different threads that you bring together your identity as Cuban, Colombian, American, and thinking about how you're moving between popular dance and moving out into theater again, and coming back again into the popular televised stage performance that Eurovision becomes. So hugely sort of almost amoeba like in terms of moving through. I'm fascinated to see and read, most importantly, and obviously whenever you're ready to speak about the next part of raffian, the threads and how the movement, and that will be quite an interesting journey for us to, well, certainly I'm looking forward to learning more about that in due course.
Oh,
Any
thanks.
spoilers and how you describe the movement?
In La Mentira Complaciente,
Yes.
well, so the piece is based around one particular dance form in Colombia called the mapalé, and you usually see the mapalé done. It's sort of, again, here we go with the hotel and the cabaret shows, because at the end of the day, I'm really like a latent cabaret dancer. These shows are put on at tourist hotels or at sort of these folkloric dance culture performances, and they dress the dancers in raffia and little bikinis, and they do these frenetic, rhythmic, a lot of bodily isolation movements. But what's interesting is that the dance has become exoticized and eroticized. And most of the dancers, they hire sometimes Black dancers, but usually they're not. And even in the Barranquilla Carnival, which happens once a year, they have these representations of the mapalé, and it's really very different from the actual mapalé, which has its sensuality and eroticism, but it's not the way it circulates as a commodity in touristic and sort of white supremacist framings. So the Rafael Palacios' framing of the mapalés, he literally pulls it apart choreographically and episodically through the different solos and duets he presents. And then what I really appreciate, he's always kind of undoing, I'm saying that he's undoing the ways in which we expect to see in this context Black Colombian bodies, because Black Colombian bodies dancing is always like the folkloric spectacle, right? The sexy folkloric spectacle. And he's saying no. And so the piece is actually one big refusal, but it's also giving you something else. It's offering you something else. And generally the dancers are in suits. He dresses them in blazer and trousers. And then there's one gorgeous moment with, which is the image you see there of the dancer. And the whole solo is she's really uncomfortable wearing the raffia. And at one point she winds up taking it off, and she turns around and makes this gesture. So it's also the potent use of gestures that we're all familiar with, but where you choose to have them, right? And then for me, and this is how I'm educating myself as I write this. So I need to read a little bit more about Acogny and Acogny technique and her choreographies, not because I'm saying that his is derivative of that or anything like that, but I do believe that the pedagogical exchanges and him coming out of that genealogy of L'École du Sable, dealing with contemporary dance and Africanist aesthetics, does play a role in perhaps some of the compositional and choreographic choices he makes. So yeah, right. That Edward Glissant's The Right to Opacity. I'm thinking about that a lot as well. Like what is the choreography presenting, but also hiding, right? And then the multiple. And here, this is Susan Manning. The different spectatorships as an insider of Colombian culture and as an outsider. I'm not saying I'm the insider. I'm just saying the multiple spectatorships when you see this piece, like how you enter it, given your knowledge of Colombia or not, or given your knowledge of dance studies, but within a Black American context versus, right, a Colombian context or European context. Yeah. But my favorite part is I went to see it in, this is anecdotal, but I went to see it in New York, and we just happened to be at the same time. Nadine George Graves, who's also a colleague, but also a dance colleague. And most of us know who Nadine George Graves is. And I said, okay, come meet me there. And she went, and when the piece ended, she was the first person to stand up and give it a standing ovation. I was like, if Nadine likes it, check. I remember thinking that. Anyway, all right.
I
Over
love
to
those
you.
anecdotes. I think that
Yeah.
it just reminds me of the collegiality within the dance studies, particularly the association, and of course SDHS and CORD in their previous lives. If you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat. We're going to move to Rebecca. I feel like we've kind of gone on such a journey. I'll just maybe remind everybody, we're talking about methods in creating scholarship. I know that, Rebecca, you're at the moment, you're thinking about performing trauma in your work. But I just wanted to ask you if you could share some insight, whether it's from Dancing Jewish or into your new work, on how you are creating your own identity as a scholar in your field of studies and as a leader in your field of studies.
Thank you. Yeah, I've had the opportunity to read some of Melissa's work in process on this project, so it's great to hear how things develop over time. So I'll back it up a little bit just to sort of think about more generally the methods that I use as a dance scholar, which I think are really significant methods that dance scholarship brings to the table. But and some of these are not specific to dance scholarship. So I do archival research. So I dig in archives, some of them, established archives like the New York Public Library's dance division. I go over to artists' houses pre-pandemic and ask them to dig up materials in the boxes that they store underneath their bed, of all these things that they've collected that they haven't necessarily archived yet because they're still working artists. I use oral history, so I do a lot of interviews of the artists I write about. I utilize something that Melissa was talking about, which is descriptive analysis or performance analysis, where and this gets a little bit into the concept of performative writing, but I use description and analysis of performance to really give body to the works I'm talking about on the page, and to I see that process of sort of really digging in and writing about and embodying somebody's work through words as a duet, as a kind of an embodied dialogue between me and the art that I'm talking about. And that's something I do in both of my projects. And then in my first project, I used a lot of embodied scholarship. So I can talk more about this later. I don't use embodied scholarship in the current book, but in that first book, I did a bunch of things. My first semester in graduate school, I was invited to tour with the dance company, and the piece was the Margaret Jenkins Dance Company. In this piece that was about immigration and assimilation. And so I realized while I was in that process inside of it, that it was a piece about Jewishness, but it was so assimilated that it was hard to perceive it. So I write about that piece in my book from the inside and from the outside of both process and product. And another part which was significant for me in that book was I asked some of my subjects to make me a Jewish dance. So I like, as a graduate student, with no resource, I literally called up famous artists that I was writing about and said, hey, will you make me a Jewish dance? Knowing that was a very vague and loaded question, and was very curious when they actually said yes, which was shocking to me, how they would unpack that request and what Jewish meant to them and what Jewish dance meant to them, and how they would put that onto my body. And so that resulted in a solo called Make Me a Jewish Dance. I also made myself a couple Jewish dances, and I write about that process throughout my book. I have sort of 3 sections, that sort of prologue, entr'acte, and curtain call that discusses that project. My current book is, I think it's called Moving Memories, Representing the Holocaust in Contemporary Performance. And it looks at dance as a critical site for Holocaust representation in over a dozen works created by both Jewish and non-Jewish choreographers in multiple countries. So not just the US, which was the focus of my first book, but Austria, Belarus, Canada, Germany, Hungary, Israel, Poland, and the UK. And, just as is the case in my first book, Holocaust studies is its own field. It's its own complex pile of books to crack. And there are lots of books about Holocaust representation in film, visual art, theater, literature. There are no books about Holocaust representation in dance. So this will be the first book about Holocaust representation in dance. It's not the first book that addresses Holocaust in dance, but it's the first book about Holocaust representation in dance. And I argue that dances about the Holocaust, or dances that engage with the Holocaust and memory and trauma, make those dances serve as a fertile platform for making intervention in a very complex history of trauma and loss and intolerance and bigotry. And I show how representations of the Holocaust set history into motion. I look at site-specific works and often a very famous like Holocaust memorials, and how they sort of push memorials out of stasis through activating spaces, and how these dances activate individual and collective memories and generate effective and emotional responses in audiences, which is part of the reason why I'm using moving memories. So playing with the idea of how dance moves memory, but also how these dances might in fact be emotionally effective or moving in both positive and complicated and problematic ways. So I'm thick in it, and I can show a little bit. I don't know if we have time for showing a little bit of what I'm working on.
We do, absolutely, yes.
So I'll share. I'm writing about a lot of works, but this semester I've been presenting about one specific piece, which is a Hungarian piece. It's an experimental dance work, and it's a duet for a 90-year-old Holocaust survivor and a 30-year-old dancer who is not Jewish. And I thought this would be a very sappy dance when I sort of was reading about it, and it's really richly experimental work, and it is, to me, so beautiful. There's a documentary I can show you. I'll show you a trailer of the documentary, but there's a documentary that charts the process of making this dance, in which you see how dance really functions as this place for healing, and you can see how the process of creating this work creates this very deep relationship between this 30-year-old woman and this 90-year-old woman, and how the process of making the dance actually helps heal this 90-year-old's body. Like that she is very frail and she has to go to physical therapy. But by the time the dance is being performed, she doesn't need physical therapy because they've integrated physical therapy movements into the warm-up of making the piece and into the piece itself. And then, in the end, she tells, her very tragic story about losing her entire family at Auschwitz, and how she still struggles with issues like anger at her mother, for example, choosing to go to the gas chamber with the younger child and not staying with the older child, and sort of really interesting complexities that you don't really hear about when you hear even this particular survivor talk about her experiences like at Auschwitz, because she's a very celebrated speaker. So I think it was. I'll just say that they did 90 performances. So it's like one for every year of her life, which I think is really poignant. But also, like, Hungary right now has an autocratic government and a leader, who's as scary as Donald Trump, and so there's an importance, there's really a need for the work to intervene in sort of the anti-immigration, sort of unified ethnicity that the sort of Hungarian government is pushing again. So there's also like a political efficacy that the work has in offering those stories to Hungarian public, not just sort of the European toward Europe. So yeah, it's an impactful piece, and it's intimate. It's a small theater, like maybe 60 viewers per time.
Wonderful. I'm so pleased. I am curious, just to turn back a little bit to the front cover of Dancing Jewish. Talk us through a little bit the cover of this. this wonderful book?
So that's a picture of the dancer Pauline Kohner, who people might know of as being one of Jose Limon's early company members in like the Morse Pavane. If you've ever seen the film of the Morse Pavane, she's just this amazing, like very emotive firecracker of a dancer. And in her very early career, before she was dancing with Jose Limon, she did a lot of solo dances at the time. This is the late 1920s and early 30s, where dancers would do these packed solo evenings where they would transform, particularly white dancers, they would transform their ethnicity sort of by doing, I'm going to do a Spanish dance, I'm going to do sort of a Thai dance, and I'm going to, and so I think a little bit about sort of Jewishness at that moment as both white and not white, and sort of seeking whiteness through appropriation. So there was that happening, but she also in those platforms would do Hasidic dances in drag. And I discovered through my research that there were a bunch of women at that time who were doing Hasidic dances in drag at a time when, women couldn't have bat mitzvahs, there were no female rabbis. So I saw that as very much an intervention in a much more conservative, patriarchal mode of expression through dance. And that photograph was in her autobiography, and she died, and then her archive went to the New York Public Library. And before it was processed, I was given permission to look through it. And I found that photograph in the archive, which was I was so excited because I knew, from the moment I saw that picture, that's a book cover.
It was a book cover, and it's just such a beautiful, I mean, it's really eye-catching, and just really a wonderful cover image for your book. We've got a few moments for some questions, so do please write in. We'll have the chat facility, or you can message me directly. I've got one that's come to me directly. Melissa and Rebecca, what do you hope for the future of dance studies? What's your hope for the field? And you can chat amongst yourselves.
That's a great question, especially since now I'm immediate past president of Dance Studies Association. I know that with the board I worked with throughout my tenure, we were very much committed to social justice, diversity, equity work, basically undoing white supremacist structures within dance studies in order to, have more equity. And that doesn't come without discomfort, sacrifice, uncomfortable conversations, folks perhaps not feeling welcome in particular spaces. And, I'm just thinking about all the conversations that the board and we had, and then also Lizzie Leopold, the executive director, and I, the many emails or phone calls or interpersonal conflicts we had to sort of mitigate. And these things happen, right? Because ultimately we're trying to undo particular systems of power that have raised up certain bodies, certain dances, certain cultures as canonical. And we're trying to create a more, ideally, I think the future of dance studies should be pluralistic and accepting of difference, of critical difference in all of its valences, which I think opens up the possibility of so many fabulous, interesting, engaging connections between dance and disability studies, dance and indigeneity, dance, and, you name it, right? Dance and the environment and trans-Pacific water study, right? There's people talking about the Pacific. So I think it makes things exciting, and also just the ability to kind of create innovative methodologies and break forms and really bring in marginalized or historically marginalized voices and see, what are their world-making practices and how can we think about them as models for the future. I don't know. That's what I think. but yeah, I think dance studies is a very, because it's based on bodily practices, I think it's a very open field. There's no limits to what it can do, right? But I think that's historically it has a bad rap. Right, it's white supremacy. Because I always tell the story of like when I went to my first SDHS, I was a grad student, third year, I think it was at Duke, and I gave a paper on that eventually became my Lucy Guerin publication that came out in Brolga. So I was writing about Lucy Guerin, and I was theorizing using Deleuze and Guattari, right? You can't get any whiter than Lucy Guerin and Deleuze and Guattari. And I remember and the room was, was pretty white. And there I was as a third year grad student presenting on what, and there was still crickets and tumbleweeds after I presented. And I thought, oh my God, am I in the right space? Is this, and then, but that was 2003. And now 2022, there was a very diverse room and we were dancing to Whitney Houston during a critical, lesbian dance theory party. So things have changed. And so I'm hopeful of continued change.
I don't have anything to add. I think Melissa's really the perfect person to answer that question, given her role in really reshaping and pushing forward the major organization in our field. Did an amazing job over those years that you were,
but yeah.
and all the people that you assembled in that board. Yeah.
Yeah.
But for me, as somebody who came to SDHS well, it was probably 2009 at Stanford University. And, there was still, I guess, when we find our identity as scholars, and I'm interested when, it took a while for me to find my little path, but I think when I think of both of you as scholars, as representatives of those fields of study that are so really truly unique, because in a way, to kind of go back to that auto theory, you bring so much of your identity to the work as women, as scholars, as interested in, Cuban, Colombian dance, as interested in contemporary Jewishness, but also thinking about past and present and really tussling with the identity of Jewishness. It's great that, this is now seen alongside, some of the more sort of, welcome. There are other areas that are emerging in dance studies, like, lesbian studies. And I think it's just terrific that, it's become a lot more pluralistic than when certainly, the field was, back in, certainly for me, 2008-9, and certainly in terms of evolving and being more inclusive. So thank you both for your contributions to this really necessary field as we kind of understand culture and understand people in general.
And
Thank you.
I think it was you, Rebecca, who mentioned Naomi Jackson's new book on ethics and dance. And I think that there are ethical ramifications for what we choose to write about, make dances about, based on our positionality or our familiarity with the material, and then our years of intellectual labor, perhaps studying something that is not necessarily your cultural background. I think there was a really great plenary at ASTR recently by a grad student of mine at UMD, and it's about the right to cite, right? And thinking about, who has the right to cite and why are certain people citing particular scholars, artists, and what does that mean? And you have to think about the relation, again, your historical, political relationship to the citation and the systems of power that create these inequities. And also just, neoliberal and competitiveness is like, you want to make yourself, ultimately, some people want to be able to get a job, so they want to show they can cite certain things, but are they really using it because they know and they believe in the politics that are being put forth, or is it again a type of expedient way to get that job? I don't have answers to any of these questions, but I do think that it's important to ask more questions than necessarily answer them. Yeah.
And on that wonderful note of asking questions, we may not necessarily always have answers, but the importance of asking questions. Thank you to both our speakers, Melissa Blanco Borelli, Rebecca Rossen, two esteemed colleagues who I feel quite privileged to have joined us in our guest lecture series event. Thank you everybody for coming along this evening, or certainly this evening in the United Kingdom. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event in February, which will be focused on dance education in contemporary times. And we'll be looking at the work of Alf Daniels Mabingo and Christy Mortimer. So a Uganda, New Zealand context. So again, keeping it really global. Thank you all for coming and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everyone.